The $18 gun that outlasted everything. How America's most hated weapon served for half a century. The M3 grease gun cost $18.50 to manufacture and served the United States military for 50 years, longer than any other submachine gun in American history. It fought in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War in 1991. Soldiers initially called it a plumber's nightmare and tried to throw it away. Yet this stamped metal weapon outlasted the beloved Thompson that initially cost over $200 to manufacture in 1939, outlasted the M1 Garand rifle, outlasted nearly every weapon America fielded in the 20th century. How does the cheapest gun in the arsenal become irreplaceable? The answer reveals something fundamental about warfare that military planners sometimes forget. Sophistication doesn't win battles, reliability does, and the ugly weapon that looked like plumbing supplies proved more reliable than weapons that cost 10 times more to build. If you ask military historians about American submachine guns, you'll hear reverence for the Thompson, stories of gangsters and paratroopers, of American heroes clutching that beautiful weapon. But ask about the M3 and the response changes. You'll hear different words, uglier words, words like disposable and cheap knockoff. You'll hear that soldiers mocked it, refused to carry it, begged for their Thompsons back. Yet by the time the grease gun was finally retired in 1992, some soldiers were genuinely sad to see it go. Commanders kept M3A1s in their arms rooms years after they were supposed to turn them in. According to some veterans and secondary sources, a few suppressed M3A1s remained in special operations inventories into the late Cold War, even after newer submachine guns such as the MP5 appeared. How long they stayed in actual operational use is unclear, but they seem to have survived much longer than anyone in 1943 would have expected. The weapon designed to be thrown away became the weapon nobody could replace. This transformation, from contempt to trust, didn't happen because the weapon changed. The M3 in 1991 was essentially the same gun it had been in 1944. What changed was soldiers' understanding of what actually matters when someone is trying to kill you. To understand this story, we need to go back to October 1942, when two men at a car headlight factory were given 7 months to solve an impossible problem. Let's join Beyond History, where historical stories are told from a different perspective, slower and deeper, to answer and listen to the questions in the flow of history. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Your support is the driving force that helps us to send everyone better quality products. By autumn 1942, America faced a manufacturing crisis that threatened the entire war effort. The Thompson submachine gun, magnificent, powerful, and beautifully machined, had been a symbol of American industrial pride. But pride could not win a global war. A Thompson cost over $200 in 1939, and even after its wartime simplifications, still cost $45 by 1944. Worse than the cost was the labor. Each gun consumed roughly 150 man-hours of skilled machine work, requiring high-precision milling for a weapon that millions of soldiers were expected to carry. America was preparing for a war across 2 oceans against enemies who had spent years building their arsenals. The United States had manpower, factories, and resources, but not time. Perfection, in 1942, was a luxury the Army could no longer afford. So the Army Ordnance Department looked outward. Across the Atlantic they saw the Sten gun, a crude-looking British submachine gun built during the Blitz out of desperation. It had no elegance, no polish, but it fired, and it cost almost nothing. In German hands, the MP40 demonstrated another lesson. Stamped steel, spot welds, and industrial simplicity could create a weapon effective enough for mechanized warfare. If America wanted a submachine gun fast, and in numbers that matched global conflict, it would require a philosophical break from everything the Thompson represented. In October 1942, the specifications came down with brutal clarity. Build a submachine gun from stamped steel. Chamber it for 45 ACP, the ammunition America already produced by the millions. Keep the rate of fire under 500 rounds per minute to improve control. Make it cheaper than anything on the battlefield, much cheaper. And do all of this immediately. Into this storm stepped two men who, under normal circumstances, should never have been designing weapons at all. George Hyde, working at GM's Inland Division, specialized in designing automobile components. Frederick Sampson, chief engineer at GM's Guide Lamp Division, oversaw the production of blackout headlights. Neither man had built a gun intended for war. Neither had designed a weapon meant to endure mud, cold, or combat. But they had something far more valuable: mastery of industrial manufacturing. They understood how to shape steel quickly, cheaply, consistently. They were given 7 months. What emerged from their collaboration was revolutionary, not because it was advanced, but because it was ruthlessly simple. The receiver was made from 2 stamped metal halves welded together like a factory-pressed car panel. Only 3 parts required machining: the barrel, the bolt face, and the trigger mechanism. Everything else, springs, housings, guards, covers, was stamped, pressed, or welded. The total parts count was 23. The Thompson had more than 60. The design's genius lay not only in minimalism, but in philosophy. Instead of demanding microscopic tolerances, Hyde and Sampson built the gun around generous spacing. This made the weapon easy to manufacture, and as soldiers would later discover, surprisingly resilient. Mud, sand, and water fouled precision weapons like the Thompson or M1 Garand. But the M3 had room for filth. It was built loose, and loose meant reliable in the worst environments. When production figures came back, the results stunned the Army: $18.50 per unit. The military had asked for cheap. They got something cheaper than anyone believed possible. By May 1943, the first M3s rolled off production lines. Army brass, still thinking in pre-war standards, issued guidance that matched the gun's design intent. Treat it as disposable. When it broke, whether in training or combat, throw it away and requisition another. No repairs, no sentimentality. It was built fast, meant to be replaced fast. The development timeline was unprecedented. Concept to prototype to mass production in 7 months. Few American weapons before or since have matched such speed. By the end of the war, over 606,000 M3s and 15,000 M3A1s had been manufactured. A weapon created under industrial duress had become one of the most produced American submachine guns of the conflict. Hyde and Sampson had solved the manufacturing problem with brilliant efficiency. They had created a tool, cheap, simple, and scalable to the demands of global war. But there was something neither engineer nor ordnance planner could predict. Weapons do not live or die in factories. They live or die in the hands of soldiers. The M3 would soon leave the assembly lines and step into the unforgiving judgment of the American infantrymen, men who trusted their lives to their weapons and cared little for manufacturing philosophy. What mattered was simple: would it work in combat? The answer would take the M3 into jungles, deserts, snowy forests, and ruined European cities, and would ultimately shape one of the longest, strangest careers of any American firearm. June 6, 1944. The night sky over Normandy was black except for anti-aircraft fire, tracing red arcs through darkness. Inside, C-47 transport planes, paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions made final equipment checks before jumping into occupied France. Many looked at the weapon strapped to their right leg and felt something between disappointment and disgust. 22.8 inches of stamped metal that resembled, as more than one paratrooper would later observe, something a plumber might use for greasing pipe fittings. The M3 made its combat debut on the war's biggest stage, and soldiers hated it. For airborne forces, the M3 offered one advantage. Unlike the Thompson, it didn't require disassembly before jumping. With the wire stock collapsed, you could strap it to your leg, leap into darkness, hit the ground, and fight immediately. In theory, perfect for airborne operations. In practice, the contempt was immediate and widespread. Private Don Burgett of the 101st Airborne, in accounts that would surface years after the war, reportedly described his first impression in a single phrase: "Piece of junk." Whether these were his exact words or a paraphrase capturing general sentiment isn't entirely clear from historical records, but the feeling was real. Many paratroopers who had trained with the iconic Thompson viewed the M3 as an insult to their elite status. If the Army truly valued their lives, these soldiers reasoned, they wouldn't issue the arsenal's cheapest weapon. Private D. Eberhardt of the 42nd Infantry Division, who trained on the M3 at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, would recall that he and fellow infantrymen held it in mild contempt, considering it a cheap knockoff of the German MP-40. That comparison stung. American soldiers didn't want weapons that felt inferior to enemy equipment. The nicknames soldiers created told the story. Plumber's Nightmare was most common, but you also heard Cake Decorator for its resemblance to frosting tools. Grease Gun eventually stuck, borrowed from the industrial tool. None were affectionate. These were insults wrapped in dark humor. Then technical problems appeared, and contempt turned to fury. The side-mounted cocking handle, sheet metal attached to the bolt, broke constantly. Drop the M3 on its left side, the handle usually survived. Drop it on the right side where the handle protruded, and thin metal snapped. Once broken, you couldn't chamber around. You carried a 7-pound paperweight. Field repair depots in France found themselves overwhelmed after D-Day. Ordnance technicians cut slots into receivers and fabricated crude replacement handles just to keep guns operational. Photographs from General Patton's Third Army around the Battle of the Bulge show M3s with these field modifications. The National Military History Museum in Luxembourg holds at least 5 M3s bearing evidence of such repairs. The magazine created additional problems. The single-column 30-round design proved difficult to load and jammed easily with dirt. Sergeant M. Morris, writing for Yank magazine, documented frontline complaints. The magazine release on the grease gun is too loose, and when slight pressure is exerted on it as the gun is carried slung on the shoulder, the magazine will fall out. Consequently, the men take a ball hammer and bend the release slightly so as to make it more secure. Soldiers were using hammers to manually bend metal parts because factory design didn't work. Some cut M1 rifle operating rod springs into sections to strengthen the magazine release. Others developed elaborate carrying methods to avoid stressing the weak catch. Consider what this meant. Soldiers who might need this weapon to save their lives were repairing it with hammers and scavenged parts before trusting it. The anger and fear this generated is difficult to overstate. For months after D-Day, the M3's reputation seemed permanent. It was the gun nobody wanted, the weapon you tried to trade or accidentally break to requisition a Thompson. But slowly, unexpectedly, something began changing. By late 1944, acceptance extended beyond the infantry into specialized roles where the M3's characteristics proved ideal. Armored crews were among the first to embrace it. Tankers needed a compact weapon they could maneuver inside a steel hull barely wider than their shoulders. The Thompson was powerful, yes, but it was heavy, front-loaded, and awkward in the confined spaces of a turret. The M3, with its slim profile and retractable wire stock, slipped into the cramped geometry of a Sherman or Stuart without snagging on radios, periscopes, or ammunition racks. If a tank brewed up, a nightmare every crew trained for but prayed would never happen, the M3's small size and quick readiness might mean the difference between escaping the flames or dying inside them. Reconnaissance units also found an unexpected ally in the grease gun. These soldiers operated on thin lines, scouting roads, probing village edges, checking river crossings under constant threat of ambush. They needed something light, quiet to carry, and capable of accurate bursts without wasting ammunition. The M3 fit that world perfectly. Its slower rate of fire allowed scouts to deliver short, controlled shots in sudden encounters, just enough to break contact or suppress an enemy long enough to slip away and report. The Thompson, with its roaring appetite for ammunition, could reveal a patrol's position too quickly. The M3 was more discreet, more deliberate, suited to men who survived by avoiding detection rather than overwhelming the enemy with noise and volume. Even paratroopers, famous for their love of the Thompson and not easily persuaded to change, began warming to the grease gun in selected situations. The M3's stamped steel frame was not elegant, but its durability in weather and its ability to keep firing after a hard landing or a rough drop earned quiet respect. Airborne logistics officers also appreciated a practical advantage. The M3 cost a fraction of a Thompson. Where the Army needed to arm truck drivers, tank crews, mortar teams, engineers, medics, and rear-line units quickly, the M3 allowed mass distribution without sacrificing effectiveness. Then, by early 1945, the grease gun took on a symbolic role in the armored spearheads driving into Germany after the Ardennes. When the US introduced the M26 Pershing, the long-awaited heavy tank meant to counter the Tiger and Panther, many crews were issued the M3 as their personal defensive weapon. It rode with the new tank as part of America's modern armored image. The grease gun became, strangely, the humble companion of giants. Photographs from Cologne, Remagen, and the Ruhr show Pershing crews stepping out for patrol or guard duty with the M3 slung across their chest. A weapon once mocked, now entrusted to soldiers operating the Army's most advanced ground system. Trust, once earned in war, spreads quickly, and by 1945, trust in the M3 was no longer a rumor whispered among patrol leaders or infantry squads. It had become a quiet doctrine shaped not by theory but by experience. Soldiers realized that the grease gun did not pretend to be elegant, beautiful, or prestigious. It simply worked everywhere, across deserts, forests, mud plains, ruined cities, and snow-choked mountain passes. In a world where every malfunction could cost a life, reliability was not just a technical property. It was a moral one. By the war's final months, the grease gun had evolved from an unwanted substitute into something deeper, a companion of survival. A tool that stayed loyal in the worst conditions, a weapon that ignored vanity and proved its worth in the only place that truly mattered: combat. A Sherman tank's interior was no place for claustrophobics. Roughly 19 feet long and 8 feet wide, 5 men operated in that steel box, surrounded by ammunition, mechanical components, and the roaring engine. Interior temperatures could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Every surface was hard metal that could injure you when the tank hit obstacles or took incoming fire. When enemy infantry attacked, crews needed weapons they could grab quickly, bring through small hatch openings, and fire without recoil injuries in cramped quarters. The M3 proved ideal for this scenario. By late 1944, many Sherman tanks carried up to 5 submachine guns, often M3 grease guns, one for each crew member, for close-range defense against enemy infantry. The low recoil meant commanders standing in turret hatches could fire one-handed without injury. The 45 ACP round, while ineffective at distance, was devastating at the close ranges where tank versus infantry combat occurred. On November 5, 1944, a photographer captured Corporal Carlton Chapman of the 761st Tank Battalion, the legendary African-American Black Panthers, peering through his Sherman's hatch near Nancy, France. His M3 is visible, slung and ready for immediate use. Chapman and the 761, fighting both enemies and prejudice, understood that disabled tanks meant seconds to escape through hatches, while enemy infantry tried to prevent that escape. Armourer Russell Spooner, serving with a different tank unit, would later attempt explaining the psychology to civilians. An M3 lifted above the hatch opening could spray the countryside with a lot of bullets in a matter of seconds. This would discourage a nearby enemy from any attempt to interfere with those who needed to abandon their tank. Consider the terror inherent there. Your tank is hit, perhaps burning, ammunition possibly cooking off inside. You need out immediately, but enemy soldiers wait for you to expose yourself climbing from the hatch. The M3, in those life-or-death seconds, might be your only chance. Lift it up, spray the area, hope it buys escape time. The M3's value in armoured operations was demonstrated dramatically in early April 1945, when elements of the 14th Armoured Division reached a prisoner-of-war camp near Hammelburg, Germany. Nearly 500 American officers were inside, including men captured during the Battle of the Bulge. Camp gates were locked. German guards had fled, but left those gates secured. 2 soldiers from the 47th Medium Tank Battalion dismounted from their Sherman. They raised their M3 grease guns and shot the locks off. The gates opened. The prisoners walked free. Consider being one of those prisoners, weeks or months in captivity, wondering if liberation would come, if you'd been forgotten. Then hearing American tanks, hearing that distinctive burst of submachine gun fire, hearing metal breaking. Suddenly gates open and American soldiers stand there, some carrying those ugly stamped metal guns that meant home. In that moment, appearance didn't matter. Cost didn't matter. The M3 had become what Hyde and Sampson never intended, a symbol of American industrial effectiveness. While tankers and infantry learned to value the grease gun in conventional combat, other Americans were using it for missions that would remain classified for decades. While the world watched massive battles across Europe and the Pacific, another war played out far from newspapers and newsreels. It was a war fought in shadows, carried out in back alleys, abandoned barns, dim rooms above cafes, and forests where every twig snap could mean discovery. This was the realm of sabotage and silent killing, of railroad explosions timed to halt troop movements, of couriers passing messages under Gestapo surveillance, of men and women who lived each day knowing a single mistake meant torture and execution. The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor to the CIA, needed weapons suited not for infantry skirmishes or armored assaults, but for quiet work. A loud gunfight ruined everything. A single unsuppressed shot could doom an entire resistance network. In this clandestine world, silence was more than desirable. It was survival. Suppressors existed, but few weapons were truly compatible with them. High-velocity ammunition produced a supersonic crack that no suppressor could mask. Many submachine guns relied on finely tuned mechanisms that choked when a suppressor increased back pressure. Others were simply too large, too heavy, or too awkward for agents who needed to disappear into crowds. The M3, almost accidentally, offered solutions to problems OSS had struggled with for years. It was compact enough to hide under a coat. It used 45 ACP ammunition, naturally subsonic, producing no supersonic crack. Its blowback mechanism was simple, forgiving, and could cycle reliably even when fitted with a large suppressor. So in late 1942, while standard M3s were being prepared for conventional infantry and armored units, the OSS quietly launched a classified program. The High Standard Company received orders to build roughly 1,000 suppressed M3 variants. The work touched several corners of the American wartime scientific community. Guide Lamp Division drilled ports into the barrels to reduce gas pressure. Bell Laboratories, drawing on industrial acoustic research, designed a 14.5-inch suppressor, built not with traditional baffles, but with wire mesh wound tightly like a metallic sponge. The resulting weapon was astonishingly quiet. In tests, the suppressor absorbed so much of the muzzle blast that the metallic click of the bolt cycling was often louder than the report of the shot. At a few meters, the sound was closer to a dull mechanical thump than to the sharp crack people expect from a normal gunshot, even though it was not completely silent. To an OSS agent slipping through occupied streets at midnight, that difference meant life. These suppressed M3s were delivered into German-occupied Europe through a mixture of airdrops, sea deliveries, and courier networks. Surviving accounts and later research suggest that some of these weapons reached French Maquis groups preparing ambushes, as well as other underground cells operating in the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. Their quiet operation made them particularly attractive for missions where even a single loud shot could compromise an entire resistance network. Still, the exact distribution of these weapons remains difficult to trace today, as many wartime records were never preserved or were deliberately destroyed. One surviving suppressed M3 with documented provenance offers a rare glimpse into this shadow war. According to collectors and fragmentary historical references, it was issued to a European resistance fighter for a mission planned for late April 1945. The target and operational details remain unclear in surviving sources, and the war ended before the mission was carried out. The weapon was never fired. It survives today as a silent artifact of a mission frozen by history, a reminder of how many clandestine operations were planned in darkness but never executed. The OSS went further. Because agents behind enemy lines could not always rely on steady supplies of American .45 caliber ammunition, the agency requested versions of the M3 that could use 9 by 19 mm parabellum. Around 1,000 dedicated 9mm M3s were built and sent to resistance groups in Europe so they could use captured German ammunition. A small number of 9mm conversion kits for standard .45 caliber M3s were also produced, though later research suggests that relatively few were made and that their combat use is difficult to confirm. OSS detachments operating in Asia, particularly those embedded with Chinese guerrilla units fighting the Japanese, also had access to suppressed M3s in limited numbers. Reports from the period describe their use in night ambushes and close-range strikes, especially in Burma's dense jungles where silence and mobility were essential. Training at OSS camps in Maryland and Virginia reflected these realities. Agents practiced hitting silhouettes at 25 yards, reloading by touch in darkness, and clearing jams silently under pressure. By the time American forces in Europe were deep into Germany in early 1945, the suppressed M3 had quietly influenced an entire doctrine of covert operations. Its success established design principles that intelligence agencies would follow for decades: subsonic ammunition, simple mechanisms, modular components, and a weapon built not for battlefield glory, but for missions that never appeared in public records. But while the suppressed M3 thrived in the shadows, the standard M3 faced a very different problem in the daylight of regular warfare. By late 1944, even as respect for the grease gun grew among infantry and armored crews, its weakest point, the fragile cocking handle, caused too many failures to ignore. Armorers were overwhelmed. Frontline reports piled up. Something had to change. And the solution, when it arrived, would be brilliantly simple, so simple that it solved the problem for the rest of the weapon's decades-long life. After-action reports flooding back throughout 1944 showed clear patterns. The M3 worked brilliantly when it worked, but that fragile cocking handle broke constantly, and a broken handle turned the entire weapon into dead weight. The knock-on effect was enormous. Supply officers in France and Belgium reported racks of M3s sitting useless in maintenance depots, sometimes whole crates of them, waiting for the one part that failed more than any other. A weapon designed to simplify logistics had, ironically, created its own miniature supply crisis. Soldiers at the front had been blunt from the beginning. They didn't ask for better aesthetics or more accuracy. They asked for a gun that would still function after being dropped in mud or slammed against a tank hatch. The M3 almost delivered that promise, almost, but the cocking handle remained its Achilles heel. Army ordnance finally acknowledged what frontline troops had been saying for nearly a year. The M3 didn't need a field repair solution. It needed a redesign. So, in December 1944, the Army adopted an improved model, the M3A1. The fix was both radical and beautifully simple. Instead of strengthening the handle, ordnance engineers removed it from the equation entirely. No handle could break if no handle existed. They cut an oval finger hole directly into the bolt, a thick, solid component already central to the weapon's operation. To charge the gun, a soldier simply inserted a finger and pulled straight back. A motion as natural as pulling open a drawer, but far more reliable under stress. It was an engineering lesson in restraint. The old cocking handle had required welding, machining, and alignment, multiple steps where error or weakness could creep in. The new solution eliminated an entire component while making the mechanism faster to produce, easier to use, and nearly impossible to damage. Soldiers now had a weapon they could charge in pitch-black conditions, with hands numb from cold, or wearing thick gloves in winter or under chemical warfare gear. Further improvements responded directly to battlefield complaints. The M3's original wire stock was serviceable but limited. The M3A1's redesign turned it into a multi-purpose tool. One end acted as a built-in magazine loading lever, another as a barrel wrench. Troops no longer needed to carry specialized tools. Everything they needed was part of the gun itself. The pistol grip gained a small internal reservoir for oil, a critical addition for a weapon meant to endure mud, rain, and long stretches without proper maintenance. And in a nod to covert or airborne use, the weapon could be fully disassembled into a compact 13-inch package, a surprising benefit for a firearm never intended to be elegant. Approximately 15,000 M3A1s were produced before Germany surrendered in May 1945. The numbers were small compared to total US wartime production, meaning most troops continued to carry the original M3, but those who received the improved version noticed the difference immediately. The fingerhole system was intuitive, mechanically satisfying, and physically robust. It solved the M3's biggest drawback in a single stroke. Then came Japan's surrender in August 1945. With peace returning, American military planners expected the M3's story to end. After all, it had been conceived as a wartime expedient, cheap, mass-producible, and disposable. Surely the Thompson, with its prestige and lineage, would reassert itself as the peacetime standard. Yet reality defied expectations. The assumption that the M3 would fade away proved spectacularly wrong. Within 5 years, as conflict erupted again on the Korean peninsula, the grease gun would be called back into service, and in the brutal hills and frozen valleys of Korea, the weapon would begin a second career, one that, in many ways, would eclipse its first. The M3 had been designed for a short, utilitarian life. Instead, it was about to become one of the longest-serving American submachine guns in history. June 25, 1950. Communist North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel. The invasion was sudden and overwhelming. America found itself at war again, this time in frozen mountains rather than European hedgerows. The M3A1, which some planners might have assumed obsolete, suddenly became critical. Ithaca Gun Company was contracted to manufacture an additional 33,200 M3A1s. The reason had ironic dimensions. Communist forces used Thompson submachine guns. The same weapon the M3 was designed to replace now armed the enemy. During World War II, America had supplied thousands of Thompsons to Chinese nationalist forces. When communists won the Chinese Civil War in 1949, they inherited those weapons and supplied them to North Korean allies. American and South Korean forces needed effective close-range weapons as counter, and the M3A1 filled that role. Korean terrain favored M3A1 characteristics. Mountain warfare meant close engagements in narrow valleys, village streets, tunnels, and bunkers. Winter conditions were extreme. Temperatures regularly hit 30 below zero Fahrenheit. The M3A1's simple mechanism and generous tolerances kept functioning when more complex weapons froze. The M3A1 became the main submachine gun for US and ROK forces throughout the Korean War, serving through desperate fighting retreats after China entered the war in late 1950, through stabilized front lines of 1951 to 1952, and through the final year ending with armistice in July 1953. When American military advisors began arriving in South Vietnam during the early 1960s, the M3A1 was still in inventory. By this point, the weapon had served continuously for nearly 20 years. Many planners expected final retirement. The M16 rifle was being introduced. The M14 was standard for conventional forces. Surely the old grease gun, designed during World War II, would now be mothballed. Wrong again. The M3A1 found multiple Vietnam roles. Regular troops carried them, though typically not as primary weapons. ARVN forces received M3A1s in significant numbers. Many South Vietnamese soldiers preferred the 45 ACP round for stopping power compared to 9mm alternatives. Helicopter crews, pilots and door gunners often carried M3A1s as personal defense weapons given compact size in tight cockpits and cabins. But perhaps the most significant Vietnam use was by Special Operations Forces, where OSS lessons from 20 years prior remained relevant. Marine Force reconnaissance units operating in dense triple-canopy jungle discovered suppressed M3A1 value. Small teams operating deep in enemy territory needed silent sentry elimination without alerting entire base camps. Navy SEALs conducting riverine operations in the Mekong Delta used suppressed M3A1s for ambushes where first shots needed silence. Sound carries clearly across water at night. Army long-range reconnaissance patrols operated in small teams for weeks, gathering intelligence. Suppressed M3A1s provided backup capability without heavier submachine gun weight. American advisors armed Montagnard tribal fighters, indigenous Central Highlands people allied with the US, with M3A1s for village defense. The weapon's operational simplicity made it suitable for fighters without extensive formal training. When Delta Force was officially formed in 1977, some sources suggest the suppressed M3A1 was their initial issue submachine gun, though confirming this with declassified official records proves difficult given operational classification. The unit allegedly carried them during Operation Eagle Claw, the failed Iran hostage rescue in April 1980, though this remains controversial and unconfirmed. By the mid-1980s, Delta had transitioned to the Heckler & Koch MP5. What's remarkable about Vietnam-era M3A1 service isn't just continued use, it's that soldiers still chose to carry it when newer weapons were available. By this point, the M3A1 had proven itself across 3 wars and multiple terrains, earning respect through decades of reliable service in conditions that broke more sophisticated designs. But the story still wasn't finished. The grease gun would serve in one more conflict, 50 years after initial design, before final retirement. January 17, 1991. Operation Desert Storm began with air campaigns representing modern warfare's cutting edge. Stealth fighters striking Baghdad, cruise missiles launching from Gulf carriers and destroyers, the night sky lit by trails of tomahawks weaving across borders, guided by GPS signals whispered down from satellites orbiting Earth. What unfolded looked like a war from the future. Infrared screens glowing inside cockpits, laser-guided bombs steering themselves through smoke, tank commanders navigating featureless desert using systems that would have been unimaginable to soldiers of 1944. Yet inside the armored steel of M1 Abrams main battle tanks and M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, tucked behind thermal sights and digital fire control panels, crews still carried a weapon born in an entirely different century of warfare. The M3A1 grease gun, a stubby 45 caliber submachine gun designed when battles were fought in hedgerows and ruined European towns, not satellite-mapped deserts. In the dim light of a tank interior, red lamps glowing softly to preserve night vision, radios crackling with encrypted chatter, the grease gun often sat in a corner rack, its parkerized steel dull and scratched from decades of handling. It looked almost anachronistic beside the futuristic displays of the Abrams. Where the tank was all angles, composites, electronics, thermal viewers, and turbine hum, the M3A1 was stamped steel and welded seams, a weapon made for mud and sweat, not microchips. But armored crews knew a truth the outside world rarely considered. Technology evolves, but space inside a tank does not. Whether it was an M60 in the 1960s or an M1A1 in 1991, there were only inches to spare. A personal defense weapon needed to be compact enough to grab in chaos, reliable after months of neglect, and devastating enough at a few feet. Because if a tanker ever fired a personal weapon, it meant the worst had happened. The vehicle was disabled, burning, or overrun. For almost 50 years, nothing did this job better than a design from 1942. Throughout the 1980s, the grease gun traveled wherever American armor went. On Cold War alert in West Germany, in training at Fort Hood and the National Training Center, across Europe during Reforger exercises, and finally into Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Tanks carried them. Bradleys carried them. Recovery vehicles kept them locked in armored storage boxes. Some sat untouched for years between annual inspections, then fired flawlessly when tested. A former tank company commander, speaking years later in interviews that circulate in military history discussions, though without formal archival documentation, described a scene emblematic of the grease gun's mythic durability. I had 2 M3A1s in my unit arms room as late as 2001. They were older than most of my soldiers. Some were stamped during World War II and were still functioning perfectly. We only turned them in when the Army finally insisted. But honestly, they still worked. Picture that timeline. A weapon assembled in 1944, while American troops were pushing towards the Rhine and the skies over Europe filled with P-51s, could still be sitting in an arms room in 2001, inspected by soldiers born almost half a century after it was designed. A weapon meant to be disposable had outlived entire generations of rifles, armored vehicles, and doctrines. Officially, the grease gun retired from U.S. military service in 1992. The Army replaced it gradually with the M4 carbine and, in some roles, the M9 pistol. But retirement on paper didn't always match retirement in practice. Various accounts from former crewmen indicate that some units kept their M3A1S unofficially for years, stored, maintained, and occasionally fired, simply because they still worked, and no one saw a reason to discard them. By the early 2000s, the grease gun had effectively disappeared from U.S. military inventories. It is unlikely that any M3A1s were still in frontline service by the time of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, even if a few may have lingered in storage or on remote bases for inspection and training. Its 50-year story had ended. But what a story it was. Think about the comparison. The Thompson, glorious, iconic, the hero of countless films, was phased out of most U.S. service by the mid-1950s. The M1 Garand, revered as the greatest battle implement ever devised, left frontline service in the 1960s. The M14, America's attempt at a post-war super rifle lasted barely a decade before being replaced. Entire families of weapons came and went. But the M3 endured, not because it was glamorous, not because it was beloved, but because it fit a role with such perfect practicality that no successor offered enough advantage to justify replacing it. Its simplicity meant fewer parts to break, even after decades in storage. Its loose tolerances meant dust, sand, and heat mattered less than they did for precision-made firearms. Its 45 ACP punch at close range met the exact distances tankers or vehicle crews might face. And above all, it already existed by the tens of thousands, paid for, proven, and dependable. The ugly duckling soldiers mocked in 1944 had, by 1992, become something like a respected elder, an old tool that had outlasted its critics. Some crews reportedly felt a real sense of loss when the era ended. They knew they were saying goodbye not to a weapon of cutting-edge firepower, but to a companion that had stood its ground through the longest technological revolution in U.S. military history. From the rains of Normandy to the frozen hills of Korea, to the jungles of Vietnam, to the sands of Iraq, the grease gun saw it all. A weapon built cheaply, issued reluctantly, and expected to break quickly instead, proved the most durable American submachine gun ever fielded. It entered World War II as a temporary solution and left Desert Storm as a quiet legend. What the grease gun teaches us. The M3 grease gun story represents one of American military history's great ironies. Everything that should have doomed it to obscurity, ugly appearance, bargain basement cost, deliberately disposable design, became the foundation for half-century service. The Thompson was a machining masterpiece, artwork that happened to kill. Soldiers loved holding it, substantial, important, matching elite fighter self-image. The M3 was stamped metal resembling plumbing supplies. Soldiers hated it at first sight. But in Normandy mud, Korean mountains, Vietnamese jungles, and Iraqi deserts, the M3 proved simplicity wins. Complex weapons with tight tolerances break under extreme conditions. The M3, with generous tolerances and minimal parts, kept functioning where sophisticated designs failed. At $18.50 per unit, less than good combat boots, it performed its mission for 50 years, while weapons costing 20 times more were declared obsolete within a decade. Private Don Burgett reportedly called it "piece of junk" in 1944 when first seeing it. But how many soldiers like Burgett, if they survived and lived long lives, must have realized years later that ugly gun saved their lives? The transformation from contempt to trust wasn't about weapon change. The M3 in 1945 was the same weapon as 1944. The transformation was about soldiers learning through hard experience what actually mattered in combat, and what mattered was reliability. George Hyde and Frederick Sampson weren't trying to create legendary weapons when working in that guide lamp factory in 1942 to 1943. They were solving a manufacturing problem. How to arm millions when time and money for perfection don't exist? Their answer? Make it simple, make it cheap, make it work. Accidentally created one of American military history's most successful weapon designs. They tried helping win one war. They built something serving in 5. The ultimate irony, the M3 was explicitly designed as disposable. Military planners stated it clearly. When broken, throw it away and requisition another. Don't repair it. Don't make spare parts. Discard it like a broken tool. Yet 50 years later, Army armorers were still maintaining M3s because they refused to break. Some disposable guns manufactured in 1943 to 1944 were still functioning in 2001, nearly 60 years of service from a weapon never supposed to last beyond a few months. Perhaps the best reflection comes from an anonymous source, reportedly a tank crew member who served in the First Gulf War, quoted in an online military history forum years after service. Though the quote's authenticity cannot be fully verified, the sentiment resonates. We had all this high-tech equipment in our tank: computers, laser rangefinders, thermal sights worth more than a house. But when we needed a weapon we could absolutely trust not to fail us, we grabbed the grease gun. That old gun never let anyone down. In 1942, America needed weapons quickly and cheaply. George Hyde and Frederick Sampson, working in a factory manufacturing car headlights, created the M3 grease gun in 7 months. It cost $18.50 to manufacture. It looked like hardware store assembly. Soldiers initially despised it, calling it a plumber's nightmare and questioning whether their lives were valued so little they'd been issued stamped scrap metal. 50 years later, when finally retired, some soldiers were genuinely sad to see it go. Commanders kept M3A1s in arms rooms even after they were supposed to turn them in, because these weapons still worked perfectly, and newer replacements didn't seem meaningfully better. The ugly duckling had become, somehow, irreplaceable. The M3 grease gun proved that in war, appearance and prestige mean nothing, only whether a weapon works when lives depend on it. For 50 years, from Normandy beaches to Persian Gulf deserts, through frozen mountains and steaming jungles, that ugly little gun designed in a car headlight factory did exactly that. Hyde and Sampson built America's cheapest submachine gun. They thought they were building something disposable, temporary, forgettable once war ended. Instead, they built something outlasting nearly every other 20th century American weapon. They built something soldiers learned trusting with their lives. They built something that, despite being designed for disposal, became impossible to replace. That's the M3 grease gun story, the weapon nobody wanted that served longer than any other submachine gun in American military history. Sometimes ugly beats beautiful, sometimes cheap beats expensive, and sometimes the weapon resembling a plumber's toolbox turns out to be exactly what soldiers need. If this story gave you a new way to look at the past, subscribe to Beyond History. We dig deeper than dates and battles. We tell the real stories of the soldiers, the tools they carried, and the decisions that shaped the world. Click subscribe and ring the bell icon so you're here with us when the next forgotten moment comes back to life.